If you're looking to experience VR titles which genuinely try to innovate and isn't just flat-screen mechanics lazily ported to the medium that completely misses the point, then consider this personally curated list a good place to start. For this video, when I say innovative, I'm defining it as titles which offer features, interactions, level design, or experiences uniquely leveraging motion control and physical input during gameplay, and are at least interesting in some ways for doing so. But please keep in mind that a title featuring in this list does not necessarily mean that I endorse them as good products or even like the whole experience in some cases. Only that I've played and acknowledge with respect that they've tried to do or feature something unique or original in VR. I believe there is much value and learning to be had for players and developers knowing about or trying these things. Also, keep in mind that I don't have a standalone headset. My personal experience is limited to PC VR only, nor will I be covering any of the really obvious titles everyone already knows about, like the Bone series and Blade and Sorcery. And I, of course, haven't tried all the games out there. I'm just one man with a limited budget. So if there is more genuine innovation only to be had on standalone devices or elsewhere which I don't have access to, and you think are truly worthwhile experiencing too, then let us all know in the comments. So let's begin. Here's my list of VR games that are innovative in some aspects. Arcaxa is an interesting transformation of a turn-based battle system that utilizes VR by having you physically gesture and aim your attacks during your turn, followed by you needing to physically move around your play space to dodge enemy attacks on their turn. Between encounters, you'll traverse a basic overworld in third or first person, the main gameplay loop being to climb procedurally generated tower floors. It's a roguelike. It's very self-aware tonally and competently executed for its perceived budget. It does some interesting stuff with the battle mechanics and how they affect your choices as a player, and while I didn't find the game held my attention long enough for completion, it's a pretty damn good early attempt at such a concept. One which I think has a lot of potential to be something very special in VR if explored and iterated on further, particularly if that attempt included a more traditional narrative experience akin to the classic Final Fantasies. Battlegroup VR is the only proper half-decent attempt at a fully fledged space RTS, which tries to leverage motion tracking in the logical and intuitive way you would expect in VR. It does a very good job in some aspects and is quite compelling when first learning its controls with the depth of customization on offer, especially in combination with the VR perspective. It can feel like you're interacting with a prototype of the potential exciting future to come for the RTS genre. Though, as you play, many small but important design flaws begin to emerge and accumulate on top of one another, which stops the game reaching greatness. It suffers from and is held back by all the familiar problems we've come to expect from a Unity engine solo dev project, though is still a cut above the rest and offers an impressive amount of features for a project of its caliber. It's another example in VR that, with better development conditions and more iterations of how the motion input is utilized, could be something very special indeed. Blaston is a 1 vs 1 dueler with a good amount of polish and lovely art style. Its unique hook being that it completely relies on physical movement as the core gameplay loop in a way I have yet to see done meaningfully in other titles. You face off against another opponent and use various guns that fire slow-moving projectiles in different ways that you must tactically exploit in order to create a bullet hell for your opponent, which you must evade physically in real life. It's the most basic use of motion tracking that you can think of in VR, and there isn't much else to experience beyond that, but sometimes the simplest things are best, especially when brought together in an attractive, polished package with clear heart and playfulness to it, which this game succeeds at, and can be a good reminder of how engaging the mere act of physical movement can be when given a suitable context. If there was ever a glimpse into how fighting games might start translating their mechanics from flat screen into VR, then Dragon Fist VR Kung Fu is it. It features an extremely interesting system of fist, palm, and finger strikes, which when hitting an opponent on various pressure points, will have differing status effects. Punching a bicep will weaken that arm for a short time, and hitting the throat with a finger strike will cause damage over time, and finger striking an eye will cause temporary blindness in that eye, as 3 examples of many. It also features an elegant, dare I say, ingenious translation of a special move system that has you pose your hands in a unique way for each character, then press a button to activate it, with maybe a follow-up gesture. It also has interesting optional experimental movement mechanics that allows movement or dodging by tilting your headset within a customizable threshold of degrees. And for me, it worked surprisingly well, and it even has controller motion movement to activate a faster run. It isn't without flaws or exploits inherent to the physics programming and hardware of today, but it is, without question, one of the most competent and interesting, innovative uses of VR in this list. Final Assault is one of the most visually and mechanically polished games to feature on this list, with a very charismatic and charming art style, free of any jank. It's a very basic RTS, if I can even call it that, which recognizes the physicality of motion controllers and contextualizes all menus appropriately. While the core gameplay loop didn't manage to hold my attention for very long at all, it nonetheless features some minor, well-realized implementations which gets it a place on this list. The main one being how you can draw a flight and attack strafing path for the aeroplanes, intuitively with your controller. The whole package on offer was definitely not my cup of tea, but it's still a good example of the importance of polish and putting VR motion to use at all times when possible, even if for only very simplistic results. Guardians Frontline is a first-person shooter, real-time strategy hybrid that has a lot going on for it in terms of mechanics and scope. The player can swap to a multi-tool at any time in-game to place and interact with a decent variety of units while still participating in the battle, or they can assume a more traditional top-down view and command from there. Motion controls have some decent uses for unit interaction, most notably that you can trace a line on the ground to circle a group of units and order them as one, and orient the facing of a placed unit with a simple wrist rotation. It's a kind of variety and potential depth with some intuitive use of motion gestures, all put together in a mostly functional package, which I haven't seen elsewhere, and is well worthy of note. What stops me from really getting into this more is the lackluster presentation, large amounts of jank, particularly in the audio and animations, and low amount of gameplay polish in general, letting the whole thing down. But absolutely still worth a look if what you have seen has piqued your interest. Now I am cheating a bit here, having said that I won't feature already well-known games, and Hot Dogs, Horseshoes and Hand Grenades is definitely one of those well-known games. But despite being nearly 8 years old as of making this video, there has been precisely 0 other VR shooters that have tried to improve upon or replicate the kind of, in my opinion, revolutionary virtual firearm interaction and simulation that we see here. Nothing in 8 years. This, quite frankly, boggles my mind. While not completely free of some quintessential VR jank, the depth and detail of firearm interactions and the physics surrounding them in H3 VR remain unmatched to this day. This includes various innovations with aim stabilization, quick bolting, ammunition collecting and loading. But despite how impressive all this is, the game itself is, for the most part, still a disjointed tech demo with some minigames attached. What we need to see is H3's weapon system ported directly into a new VR game that provides meaningful context for a player to engage with all of it. A deep, slower-paced, polished, tactical multiplayer context would be an ideal fit. So consider this as my public plea in hoping something like that can happen sooner rather than later. It would be such a massive win for the VR medium and would undoubtedly attract attention from onlookers and those still waiting on the sidelines for VR to really give a compelling reason to join the user base. Make it happen, devs. Make it happen. Into the Radius is pretty well known, but not quite enough that I would exclude it from this list. While it doesn't appear to do any kind of interaction in isolation in an innovative way, unless they were the first to pioneer the backpack system, then if so, they definitely did innovate. It is still the only title I've played which combines together a multitude of immersive, motion control mechanics into one package and pulls them off functionally, for the most part. It is a supremely technically flawed and janky experience that barely manages to hold itself together, but I think is worthwhile experiencing to see how it does so, and also to see where things can obviously be improved and polished. All in all, though, it's still a very good effort and offers some of the most engaging immersion VR has to offer, when it works and isn't being janky. Legendary Tales is a physics-based melee title, certainly not the first, and its popularity is overshadowed by competing titles like Blade and Sorcery. But in my opinion, Legendary Tales is the only VR melee game I've played that manages to feel incredibly satisfying with how it handles the clashing of weapons, at the very least. It's one of those things you must experience yourself to understand, as seeing it occur on screen does it no justice, as is true for many VR experiences. It is still an incredibly flawed and abusable combat system, however, which severely lacks polish, but the potential there is so obvious, I feel it necessary to hold it to higher standards. Standards which it fails to meet, but nonetheless is a great product to learn from and try. I think it should be experienced if only for how the parrying system has been implemented, to understand and most importantly feel how satisfying it is with motion controls. For all its failings, there is nothing else quite like it in VR at the moment. Rumball is by far the most directly, purely innovative VR gameplay experience I've personally encountered. The entire premise revolves around the player doing various combinations of positional controller poses in order to summon structures of rock that you then use in offense or defense against your opponent. The way they have done this is nothing short of impressive, and you would be surprised at how deep the various combinations and interactions can be in moment-to-moment play. It is an excellent first attempt. It's so innovative and unique, in fact. There is genuine emergent skill progression here, naturally mirrored in real life, that it serves as a shining example of how VR gaming can bring us back in healthy unison with our bodies, that there no longer need be a sacrifice of your real-world health in order to get good at a computer game. And the gratification for doing so is beyond anything traditional gaming has ever been able to offer. As is always the case, though, a tiny dev team, PvP only, lack of resources, and a seeming uncertainty of focus of where they want to take the game means it comes with some quite severe flaws. One area they drop the ball in particular is improperly training the player precisely how to use this revolutionary new input system. Assuming they don't dramatically change how input works after this video goes live, this is a must experience for anyone wishing to get a feeling for how engaging and game-changing VR could be when properly leaning into the potentials of motion control as a primary input. T for God apparently is not the first VR game to use the impossible spaces concept, but it is the only one I have personally played. Impossible spaces in VR is the concept of being able to continuously move around your own defined real-life playspace to navigate through the environments in-game, due to how it generates the twists and turns procedurally according to the size of the playspace that you define. One of the key innovations being that you can expand the perceptual playspace, no matter the size in real life. Think of it as increasing a movement speed multiplier from a traditional game, having you move further in-game than you actually are moving in real life. Then maybe you'll get the idea. You can play through the entire thing without ever needing to move virtually, and believe me when I say there is something about that which is extremely liberating. We're also used to standing or sitting still with most VR experiences that I don't think we as a player base quite comprehend how profound it is when we engage with an experience with much more physical movement. Of course, the ideal way to play this is through a wireless device, and by having enough space to take several steps around. If you have a tethered device that isn't or can't be cable managed, like myself, then it can be a very enjoyable but bittersweet experience. Vengeful Rites is a traditional, surprisingly lengthy and content-rich adventure game that wears its low-budget presentation on its sleeve. Shockingly, this unassuming single-player VR adventure game that features melee, archery, and magic is the only one I've ever played that actually requires you to swing your weapon with a realistic amount of speed, distance, and force to register a hit, to the point that it rarely or ever can be exploited or cheesed like you can in practically every other dedicated VR melee game. On top of this, magic casting utilizes a simple but effective gesture system that is very well executed, nearly always working as you'd expect. It's both impressive and saddening that this little game, made by two brothers on a tiny budget, surpasses most other dedicated VR titles made by larger teams in how it properly, uncompromisingly, and most importantly, successfully executes its use of motion input to get you physically involved and immersed. Don't be fooled by the presentation here. The gameplay is mostly jank-free. Mechanically, it gets so much right and should be taken note of. These brothers clearly get what VR is and could be, and would no doubt make something outstanding if they had the right conditions backing them up. What can I say about Vermilion that isn't already conveyed through the visuals? It's virtual painting done extremely well, super impressive in its simulation detail and replication of your actions to canvas. Despite the consistently striking professional beauty of my video thumbnails on this channel, you will be shocked to hear that I am not good at drawing or painting. Unbelievable, I know. Vermilion offers a few ways to train you in that regard, and is an elegant work of art in its own right. What is particularly innovative with this one, aside from the obvious, is that you can even run the game as an overlay within another VR game, and bring your canvas plus paint tools into those other games at any time you wish, should you feel like a spot of painting in the middle of your competitive PvP shooter. What else can I say? There is nothing else like it that I know of. And another great example of unifying game and real-life skills with motion controls. The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners needs no introduction. It's well known and respected by the VR user base already, standing alongside the likes of Half-Life Alyx and the Bone series. Its implementation of weightiness and physical force with melee swings still remains quite innovative and has yet to be replicated quite as well or refined elsewhere, in my experience, even in dedicated physics-based melee games, which I continue to find very strange. But that's not why it's in this list. Weighty motion controls have been done by others many times already. This one is here because it offers a movement option that I have not seen anywhere else. Movement decoupled from controller or headset direction. It just merely follows your thumbstick relative to where you're looking. This works really well and solves problems presented by the current standards of not being able to look or aim in one direction while moving in another, and I can't for the life of me understand why other games haven't followed suit by including this as a standard option alongside headset and controller-based movement. Not without its flaws and a little bit of jank, particularly being one of the earlier games in VR, it remains one of the best examples of a higher fidelity, full single-player experience with excellent visual polish and game feel. Finally, we have Ziggy's Cosmic Adventures. I feel compelled to say that this game was a disappointment for me. The trailers and concept looks great. High-quality visuals and animations with gameplay that seemed to be inspired from the likes of FTL, but with a nice, physical, immersive, weighty virtual reality take on it. But the actual result did not live up to that whatsoever. This isn't a review, so I won't go into any more detail as to why, but despite my disappointment, the game did innovate on one aspect of VR control very well that I haven't seen elsewhere. And that's how you control your ship's flight stick. Other VR games I've played that feature some kind of virtual flight stick or turret control have always been left wanting. The fast disconnect and desynchronization between your hand position in real life versus the position in-game has nearly always been a problem. But Ziggy seems to have solved it here with a very clever and natural solution that fits VR perfectly. Though this implementation, if you're left-hand dominant, can behave a bit weird, but works perfectly fine if holding with your right hand. It's worth experiencing how well that works, if interesting or relevant to you. But as for the rest of the game, there are other lessons to be learned, but for the wrong reasons, sad to say. So, that concludes my list of VR experiences, offering something unique or innovative which I've been hard-pressed to find elsewhere. This list is not exhaustive, and as I said at the beginning, many of these titles, about half of them actually, I don't think were good games all in all, for various reasons. But I've still respect for the innovations and risk-taking they attempted nonetheless, and would much rather have attempts like theirs be the primary, rather than the uninspired, bland, mediocre crap which does nothing interesting with VR motion whatsoever, that the industry is currently being bogged down with. Dear viewer, if you think my presence as a VR content creator has value and you feel it is important I continue to stick around, then I humbly ask that you consider supporting me via a Patreon donation. I only ever ask for £1 per produced content. The idea of this being that by itself £1 is entirely negligible, almost nothing. But if combined together with many others, then suddenly that negligible contribution amounts to something that is more than the sum of its parts. Much like I feel we need to do with VR development. Less solo work, more coming together and collaborating, because in the big picture of life, we are quite useless and ineffective as individuals. But when coming together, mountains can be moved. If I could get only 100 of the thousands of people who watch my content to donate just £1 per creation, then that would be quite literally life-changing for me and family, and further bolster what I can do as a content creator without being beholden or tempted by corporate agendas just to get by. So if you do have such small amounts to spare per month and believe it worthwhile, I would be extremely grateful. Thank you for watching, and see you again soon.